Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this exciting super salon on how to make a self. In case you hadn't made one yet, it's okay. It's not too late. What Tara is going to tell us, but we are really excited and honored to have Tara join us and to talk in particular about new book, Self-Made. But we've in Inter-Intellect style, we hope to cover a number of themes. And if you've read other pieces from Tara, to weave in about religion, culture, technology, as you know, it spans a great deal, and we are excited for a wide-ranging conversation. As you know from Anna, we are going to be trying to record this. We usually take a snapshot, but we do not include names in case just to reassure you, we don't record names on a snapshot. If we post those just as a way to give a little snapshot of us talking. And we are going to do our best. I'm going to name up front that it's going to be, there's that painful sense of not being able to necessarily in our 2 hours get to every single question. And I know we're going to have many that are put in the chat that that we want to get to. We're going to do our best to kind of open things up as we can and get to your comments, be able to reshape questions and go from there. So I'll ask you to put yourself on mute if you aren't already. And I think with that, I'm in the unenviable position of being the person speaking no one has come here to hear speak, but I will just give a brief introduction. My name is Thomas Arnold. I may have mentioned that at the beginning. I work at Tufts University's Human Robot Interaction Lab as kind of a religious studies exile in the Babylon of computer science. Doing kind of ethics for the computer science department in various ways. So as you might imagine, Tara's writing spanning religion, culture, technology was enormously insightful, and I'm excited to be here and honored to co-host with Zach. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Zach to introduce Tara and get us rolling.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you, Anna, for creating Inter-Intellect. What a delight to gather with people. Thank you all for coming. I adore Tara Isabella Burton. She is a friend, but I'm also like a huge fan. I don't know if she knows what a huge fan I am of her. She does the kind of work that I think is just the most exciting thing out there. So she does massively brilliant intellectual history and makes it fun. Like that's a hard thing to do. So very excited to be here and talk with Tara about this new book. I'm the executive director of a Latter-day Saint media foundation called Faith Matters. And part of that work, we recently launched a new magazine of LDS culture and ideas called Wayfair. So I edit that magazine. Previously, I did a lot of podcasting. One called Ministry of Ideas, which is popular intellectual history. And another one called Writ Large, which are podcasts about how books change the world. So Tara, she's the author of novels, one called Social Creature and the other The World Cannot Give. And there's a new one coming out called Here in Avalon. You should all pre-order that, like stat. But she's also done nonfiction. The one that came out previously to Self-Made is called Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. The one we're discussing tonight. Self-Made, Curating Our Image from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. She's also written for all of the best magazines in the world, including a recent totally brilliant essay that I love called Spiritual Realism in a Divided America for Plow that she co-wrote with Tim Shriver. She has a Substack called Line of Beauty that she writes with her very handsome, charming, totally delightful husband, uh, Dhananjay Yoganathan, who is a professor of classics at Columbia. Maybe it's philosophy. Philosophy. So, Tara, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for writing this book. To begin, what was the story that you wanted to tell with this book? And was there a moment that sparked that desire to tell a story like this?
Absolutely. I'm going to answer that in reverse order, which is to say, I was one of those teenagers who was really into Oscar Wilde. I was one of those theater kids. I'm sure I do not know if are others in the super salon, but it's a definite kind of person who falls in love at a young age with beauty, with dandyism, with this Wildean vision of life as art. And that was something that was enormously personally influential to me, but also intellectually influential. My doctoral thesis, it was in theology, but it was on dandyism and self-creation in the 19th century French decadent dandyist novel. And it was a bit, in a sense, kind of self-indulgent. I got to just study what I wanted for 7 years or however 5 years. And then I put it away. And I took a full-time job as a religion reporter for Vox.com, VVox, not FFox. I feel like when I say it out loud, it's never clear. I should enunciate better. But in that time, I kind of went from Oxford theology, which is very small c conservative in the sense of slow moving and lots of original texts and this kind of very historically rich approach to the magical fun world of online journalism. And particularly, this was 2017, a lot of online journalism, particularly in the religion reporting world, ended up being like writing about tweets. And because of sort of the weirdness of my job, I also ended up writing a lot about witchcraft and manifesting and yoga and wellness and all of these things that are not maybe traditionally understood as religious, but nevertheless, I argued in my first book, Strange Rites, are. So this kind of the self-creation project was put on hold. And originally I had this fantasy of writing a group biography of the 19th century French decadents. However, around 2020, as we were all living our lives online in a particular way, as I started thinking about the next project that I wanted to do, I'd become more and more interested in what I think of as the theological underpinnings of modernity or the theological underpinnings of internet culture, although I don't think it's just exclusive to the internet. And increasingly something that this sort of specific 19th century research about dandyism seemed really relevant to this sort of as yet unformed sense I had that so much of contemporary culture was about a different kind of self-divinization. And which brings me to, I decided to write self-made at first to sort of bridge the gap between what I thought was important. And then as I did the research, as I developed my argument, ultimately I realized that the story I wanted to tell is that the rise in the expectation on an economic level, on a cultural level, on a social level, that we are self-creators is part of, perhaps the biggest part of, a much more radical theological shift in how we understand what it means to be human and our relationship with with and to our purpose. Now, again, all summations are reductionist, but I'd say roughly speaking, the case that I want to make in Self-Made, that I hope I do make in Self-Made, is that we've moved from a vision of the self as, our job may be to either cultivate or transform ourselves, but in accordance with an external ideal, something that is given to us, be it modeling ourselves after Jesus with the life of the saints in a particularly religious context, or more broadly, that we are fulfilling some sort of purpose that is not immediately apparent to us and may have nothing to do with our immediate desires, to a vision of the self, which is that the thing that makes us human is that we get to determine our own purpose. What we are for is for us to decide, and being human, like doing the human thing that makes us human, the constitutive element of our humanity is that choice. Full disclosure, I don't think that's correct or true. But I think that it is understandable, and I think that you can't understand what it is to be in the modern world or to kind of anything about internet culture without looking at this shift as a fundamentally theological religious shift. I trace this in my book to the Renaissance. We talk a lot, and we can get into this later, about the Renaissance artist and the genius, but I think the philosophical underpinning you can find in a Renaissance humanist and rather heretical figure, Pico della Mirandola, himself influenced, and this is a different rabbit hole we don't need to get down, by weird hermetic occult magic stuff. But he basically has this vision of this reworking of Genesis where God basically uses up the seeds of creation. It's sort of this Neoplatonic image of like things becoming themselves, like vibey, seedy things that grow into the adult version of the thing. But he's tired, he uses up his seeds by the time he gets to humanity. So man doesn't have this kind of seed. Man doesn't have this basis of something that's supposed to grow into something else. God says to Adam, thou mayest fashion thyself. You can create yourself. You can determine your own purpose. You have no fixed place in the universe. And again, so this is deeply tied up with like God's limitations in this story. You know, God only has a finite number of seeds and he used them up. Guess humans are God now. It's sort of tied into other religious and esoteric traditions, stressing kind of human creativity over and against a diminished or demiurgic God. But what ends up happening, long story short, is that this idea, which is extremely controversial in its time, is now actually something that I think most of us in quote unquote the modern West take pretty uncritically, which is to say, we don't think about it consciously. If someone said it, we might think, but actually, yeah, the idea that we choose our own path in life, that we choose our own purpose, is just the norm. And I think that the implications of that are key to understanding everything else about, and I don't know any other way to say this, why everything is just so weird now. And we can get into more about what that means, but I don't want to monologue for too long just yet.
That's fantastic, Tara. If someone came up to me, and said, "What's self-made about?" I think when I started it, I thought it would be more about how we became narcissists. But I think what I would tell someone now is, well, it's about the death of God and the search for meaning. That's ultimately what I think the narrative that you tell is mostly getting at, is how do we find an explanation for the human creature in a world where God no longer tells you the script to live by.
Right. And where furthermore, that the idea that God, I think that commonly culturally speaking, the idea that God doesn't give us a script and we have to do it for ourselves when it comes up is sort of seen as this kind of like maybe not exclusively liberatory, but that which means that we have come of age as a civilization. I think, of course, of Immanuel Kant's famous definition of enlightenment, where he talks about the enlightened person cutting the leading strings to other people in society and using this language, which is associated with like those weird little I don't know how to put this, the weird little leashes you put kids on so they don't like get hit by a bus crossing the street. And like when you cut those, you cut yourself off from being led, and that is what enlightenment is. That is what maturity is. That is what modernity and the maturity of the human is. And I think that there's this kind of often dismissive way, and maybe I spend too much time in like specific corners of the internet where this is posited. Like, well, yeah, in the old days, we thought that like God had to tell us what to do and we didn't have certain kinds of freedom. But now we know that we can't, we don't need daddy to tell us what to do. And I find that the way that this is set up is really interesting to me, even as I disagree with it, precisely because the assumptions underpinning it are so loaded with the idea that the optimal state for the human being is one of autonomy, of one of individual individualism broadly construed, and one where we have access by looking inward to or the best access we have to both our true state, our most moral state, our realist, most authentic selves and moral selves, not just sort of desire selves, is by looking inward. And what interests me about this is not the valorization of the virtues of, let's say, courage and self-reliance, which I think, are virtues, but the assumption that we're any good at self-knowledge. Like, I feel like in order to be an effective self-creator, say, or live without a script, if indeed that is what we ought to do, this is rather a difficult thing, given, and I think there's a great wealth of wisdom on this topic. Human beings are pretty bad at knowing what we want. We're pretty bad at knowing why we want it. We're pretty bad at doing the thing that we know we ought to do. There's just so much wisdom on this. And yet I think that there's this uncritical assumption now that somehow looking within, listening to our hearts, going with our gut, and all sort of turn away from society and towards ourselves gives us privileged access to what is true. And one of the reasons I wrote Self-Made was not, I hope, to just look at this whole project and throw it out and say, we're completely wrong and we should go back to the medieval era. I don't think that. But rather to say, there's a lot of assumptions in this new ideology, which I believe are unexamined, both in terms of the history of how we got here, but also the potential pitfalls of it. And that whatever ideology we ought to live by ought to be a bit more nuanced than this uncritical vision of emotive self-reliance. And I think the gospel of authenticity does conflate often truth and emotion.
So there are a number of Latter-day Saints here in the room. And of all Christians, Mormons are most friendly, I think, to this idea of divinization, of theosis. And a recurring theme in your book is people arrogating to themselves the kind of hubris to become gods themselves. Through authentic experimentation, through particular brilliant aesthetic expression, or through strength and violence and some of the darker paths. So in the Latter-day Saint cosmology, though, there's a way of balancing the pursuit of great spiritual and moral qualities, a kind of ambition to become, with the submission to maybe a greater power or to Jesus's example. So I'm interested for you to try to help us understand, like, what was the pre-Renaissance Christian idea of becoming or growing as a human being? And then how did that switch to be more about following your heart or expressing something deeply unique?
All right. So again, caveat, this is like the reductionist version. So I'm always conscious when I say anything like this, that this is a simplification of a much more complex truth. But roughly speaking, I think it's fair to say that the medieval Christian vision of the world is one where everything is sort of is connected and part of a nature that works under sort of laws that are intelligible and God-given, and that our social lives and the roles that we play socially are as much part of like this sort of ecology of existence as rivers and plants and flowers and stars, and like kings and governors, and sort of ways in which political power is administered are kind of understand as analogous to like other parts of nature and the way it works. It's all one cohesive whole, and everything has a kind of weight because things are what they are. And I'm thinking particularly of Aquinas here, who sort of writes when in his writing about natural law, very much kind of uses these imagery of flowing and things kind of there being a kind of fundamental order or flowing of authority from one person to another that is legible and understandable. And what that kind of means, fundamentally speaking, is that our social lives are kind of have the way that I like to talk about this, it has ontological weight. Who we are, our families of origin, our ways of being in the world are meaningful. And that does not mean they don't necessarily have to be completely fixed. I mean, certainly there's like the vision of the divine right of kings and other kind of similar political ideologies are very much rooted in this. But I don't think it like, I think there's a way to like be an Aquinas reading Christian and not necessarily believe in the divine right of kings necessarily. But that's just putting that aside to say, everything has a place, and everything that we are is part of our reality. Whereas a trend that I think we see really from the Enlightenment onward is this use of the word custom, basically as a dirty word to mean these social things that we do that are kind of arbitrary and random. They're not real, or they're real in the sense that we do things this way and other people do things that way, or this is, someone from this rank wears this ermine and someone from this rank cannot. But it's all just kind of weird and arbitrary and a convention. It's custom as opposed to what is really true, which has to do with individual senses of reason or individual self-conceptions. And I think that shift between seeing our social lives holistically as part of a God-ordered universe is the most significant change. At the same time, I think another vision that we have to kind of hold alongside this is the idea of self-cultivation as if we talk about grace theologically, things get a little bit weird, but like assuming some level of theological grace and help added to like post-Aristotelian virtue ethics, the idea that we must shape ourselves in accordance with a model, and the model is Jesus ultimately, but also in individual saints. But that kind of what it is to self-create or self-shape or self-govern is to make ourselves, which are needy and hungry and horny and avaricious and sort of sinful in all of these various ways, that we must control these urges to better fit the model of virtue, of godliness, of righteousness that is presented to us in these types. So like, I think there's one way you could talk about like the hagiography as a self-help book, and I don't think that's ridiculous. I think you can say that. But what is important is that you are not learning to overcome your appetites and instincts because you want to do something or you want to be like more effective at being the person you are. There is a kind of moral duty to be that person, regardless of whether it like gets you anything, which is, I think, the difference between more contemporary notions of self-help and that. So I think that ultimately, the God-ordered universe and the external model of how we ought to be are the two things that really do get, if not altogether lost, certainly very much changed in first the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, as our sense of what it means to be human and what parts of us are real or meaningful versus merely arbitrary start to shift.
Thank you for that background. That kind of leads into one thing from the book that I was hoping that you could kind of share and expand upon a bit, which is that, from that early modern and from the Renaissance into the early modern, where there is this kind of turn toward, okay, why are we doing what we're doing? What are the bases? Your reference to Kant makes me, I'm thinking about all the maternal and like dependency metaphors that Kant uses. That's kind of pretty psychoanalytically telling. But I'm wondering if you could talk about what the kind of thread that you draw of the aristocratic self-making and the democratic self-making? Because it seems to me that going from the opposition between internal external authority, this drive towards self-making then kind of bifurcates in this way that you describe really well and draw throughout, being able to connect figures across art and movies, and from Jackie Curtis back to Beau Brummel and all of these. I just highly recommend everyone here to read the book. It's not a philosopher by philosopher intellectual history. It is going into very different spheres. P.T. Barnum. I mean, it's an amazing range. So I just wonder, to give a taste, if you can kind of talk about that divide and how we have to kind of distinguish between those two drives in a sense.
Sure. So one of the ways I talk about this book is I say it's a examination of the dandy, the entrepreneur, and why they're two sides of the same coin. And to tease that out a little bit, there's a kind of sense, I think, that we have of like the self-made man or self-made person who's a kind of hustler who works hard and gets their hands dirty and makes millions of dollars. And that's one cultural image. And then the other cultural image we have of the celebrity is the person, the wild, the Brummel, who lives their life as art, and everything looks effortless and simply sort of floats through the world. And I believe, and I argue this in the book, that these are very much two manifestations of the vision that we are basically our own gods. But they have very different political valences. And I think an important thing to recognize here from the Renaissance onwards is that the story of self-making is, as I've said, a theological story, but it's also an economic and a social story. It's a story particularly about a group of people, generally what you might call middle-class men, which is to say people who are have proximity to aristocrats, say, or those who were traditionally aristocrats but are not them, who by virtue of talents, skill, abilities they possess, artisans, merchants, etc., are able to have this kind of para-aristocratic identity. I mean, we're like very reductionistly, we're talking about the rise of the middle class. And what that kind of ends up happening as this sort of old order is overthrown, theologically as well as socially from the Renaissance onwards, the question of how to deal with the people who don't quite fit in, these liminal figures who are the like new aristocrats, so to speak, becomes really this burning question of Renaissance literature onwards. Who is the true noble? They're often coded as demigods who are chosen by God to be have these particular talents. They're not merely human. They're I call them about God's bastards, and it's of course a lot of them like Da Vinci and I believe Giotto and are in fact illegitimate sons, quite literally as well as in this metaphorical sense. Which is all to say that there's a sense there's some cultural sense that there are these mysterious liminal figures. How do we understand them and absorb them without like all of these societal assumptions collapsing? And the image that I call the aristocratic model, which is, I think, a kind of reactionary approach to shifting social systems, is that some people are just special. God's still in the picture because God picks certain individuals and gives them talent. He gives them grace. He gives them elegance or wit or the bon ton, which is basically another way of saying the je ne sais quoi. They have something, they don't work for it. And this image of the special being who might not be an aristocrat of the blood, but is still like a crypto aristocrat of spirit, is something that we see in the European self-making narrative, where it's important to have these figures because, importantly, they are not the grubby self-made merchants. They are not people who simply have money, but they're also not aristocrats. They are not blood aristocrats. They are allowed to be the exception that proves the rule, that there is some kind of hierarchical order. It's just a hierarchy that is not It is a hierarchy that is not as immediately obvious. But then you might well ask, well, how do you know who's an aristocrat of the spirit? And this is where self-creation gets kind of tricky. Because what ends up happening is this idea that if you can convince people that you're an aristocrat of the spirit, you basically, like, nobody can tell that you're not. I like to say that for every single era where there's a theory of a certain special secret God-given quality that only certain special secret people have, there is a self-help technique that promises to teach people how to have it. You see this, as early as the Renaissance with the idea of sprezzatura, which is elucidated in Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier. Of course, it's better to be an aristocratic courtier than non-aristocratic courtier, but still, you could be a aristocrat of spirit. You could have this true nobility. You could be a genius, but if you can't be, you have to have sprezzatura, this sort of apparent elegance and effortlessness. You make things look easy. Because if you look like you're not trying too hard, then it indicates that you might be one of these special geniuses for whom everything is effortless and easy because it is just a God-given ability. You see this again in fast forwarding a little bit, a couple hundred years to the Regency period, where the idea of having ton, again, a certain kind of mysterious elegance comes into the picture, and immediately there's all of these dandy novels and dandy manifestos and dandy guides saying, like, this is how you present yourself as a dandy. Hilariously, one of them was written by Benjamin Disraeli under a pseudonym before he became a famous politician. And so this idea in the aristocratic tradition that sort of starts out implicit, and then by the time we get to D'Annunzio and Nietzsche becomes very explicit, is that the power of the aristocratic self-maker is the power of influencing perception of whatever internal power it is, has something to do with the ability to convince other people of things. And what starts out as some people have this innate thing and other people can just fake it, becomes the thing is the ability to manipulate perception. Now, across the pond, in America, we have what seems to be at first glance a very different view of self-making. This is the view of Frederick Douglass and Benjamin Franklin, and hard work and virtue, and you're gonna rise up by your bootstraps. And this seems at first glance to be the complete opposite of the aristocratic model. It's what I call a democratic model. It's a vision that anybody, no matter how or where they're born, no matter their circumstances, can have the American dream by working hard. But then fast forward again a few decades by the Gilded Age, and this idea of hard work leading to success gets sort of very bound up with these ideas influenced by a self-help movement called New Thought, which is a kind of The Secret, manifesting and visualizing your health or your wealth in order to get it. There becomes this idea that what it means to work hard is also to focus your internal energy and shape reality around you by essentially positive thinking. That, again, reality is something that somebody who is canny can shape. And we find are these figures who are great entrepreneurs or great inventors like Thomas Edison, owing a lot of their popular success, not just to actual inventions, but for their ability to massage the press or have good, close relationships with journalists who are going to cover their latest inventions, as Edison famously did. He sort of he heavily implied he had invented the light bulb before he actually did, and was able to get away with it because he manipulated journalists into thinking something worked when it didn't. But again, the idea comes down to, well, actually what you're doing is managing perception. You're shaping the other people with your, firm handshake and looking your would-be colleague in the eye. This is how you develop the magnetism that attracts money, wealth, and influence to you. So totally different narratives of self-creation ultimately converge in the same place, which is self-creation is about managing what other people think of you and shaping the collective reality that is human perception. That is the field on which the shaping of reality happens, on the field of human perception.
One of the things, Tara, that I loved, you do these wonderful vignettes and portraits of people, and I think I'd heard of Beau Brummel briefly before, but you really go into this figure named Beau Brummel, and everybody should just read that Wikipedia page. Beau Brummel was this just incredibly famous for being famous socialite in England, and helped me understand that like the Paris Hilton, Kim Kardashian phenomenon, it is older than our time. You know, there's new forms to it, but like there's something deep in us that's attracted to this mysterious thing that you in the Hollywood area you called it. Like there's just something you can't look away. And we need it. We need it as like a people. We need people to focus energy on. So that's like an amazing longer term story of like the social media influencer doesn't just start with social media.
Absolutely. I mean, Brummel he originates all of this. He's an originator of SpawnCon. He gets his amazing tailor suits free because people know that when he wears them, they're immediately everyone is going to flock to buy the same thing. He wears a beaver fur hat, and like almost overnight, the beaver population plummets in North America. Now, a little bit of background: Beau Brummel, Regency era, early 19th century. He's a perfect example of this kind of liminal self-created figure. So you could say he comes from nothing and makes a success about himself. That's not quite true. You can say he's this posh aristocrat. That's not quite true. He's the grandson of an innkeeper, maybe brothel keeper. It's unclear. Son of like a civil servant, has a decent but not that exciting inheritance. But he has some money because his father is in some kind of middle-class profession. That money sends him to Eton, one of the posh public schools, where he meets who is, I mean, not as a student, but he meets the Prince Regent, soon to be George IV, known as Prinny, the Prince of Wales. We'll call him that. The Prince Regent takes a liking to this young man who's very elegant and has sort of particular manners and a way about him. And Beau Brummel gets sort of caught up into high society. Technically,
he's got a call with a notification saying that.
Are we all right?
We're good.
Okay. So via a sort of career in the military where he doesn't really do anything, Beau Brummel becomes a professional man about town. And he has this quality known as ton. Why it's, I mean, it's in French because the same way that like we say je ne sais quoi, it's not supposed to mean anything. It literally means good manners, but it means something else, which is elegance, wit, grace. And he becomes the sort of king of the dandies of London, the London fashionable society. And at this time, London fashionable society is sort of in this liminal state. You have your traditional aristocrats of blood. You have your merchants and new money people who have cash gotten in the trades. And Beau Brummel becomes this sort of originator of this model, really a liminal model of being in between. Whatever he has, his grace, his wit, it is simultaneously, you don't need to be an aristocrat to have it, but it is not something you can buy either. It becomes a new way of figuring what it means to be an aristocrat outside of traditional aristocracy. And you find what's so interesting is that even at the time, like this is not a sort of me later back reading into Brummel, even at that time and a couple sort of within a few decades, people are understanding dandyism as fundamentally a reaction to the French Revolution, to the decline of traditional aristocracy. There's this great sort of novella by Honoré de Balzac, I want to say written in the 1830s, which is purports to be a life of Beau Brummel. And in it, Beau Brummel's already in exile. He historically, this is true, has a falling out with the Prince Regent and gets syphilis and has too many gambling debts and lives in France in exile till he dies. And in this version, a group of young dandies are basically trying to do a Napoleonic code of dandyism in France. They're trying to be like, this is a new era in France, and we are in a democratic, we're sort of post-revolutionary era, and we have laws now, and we have the Napoleonic Code, and we should make one for how to be a dandy. And they go to Beau Brummel and they say, please, Monsieur Brummel, like, tell us your secret. How do you get tall? And Beau Brummel basically laughs in their faces. And he's like, you can't teach that. And he goes on this long disquisition about how in this era of like godlessness and lack of hierarchy and disorder, where there isn't a clear ranking among persons, everything is thrown into disarray. And yet it is precisely the dandy who's able to kind of create this confluence between his personality and his outward clothing, that is able to kind of rise above the chaos of modernity by creating meaning. And this sort of image of the celebrity as someone who signals what we might now consider authenticity in a certain way, although it's a very stylized authenticity, but someone whose distinct soul is successfully given an outward cast, in this case sartorially through fashion, is something that is particularly special because they're embodying a kind of link between the inner and the outer that seems lost in the like maelstrom of modernity. And this is very much Balzac's take. This is also the take another French writer, Barbie d'Aurevilly, also does a kind of semi-fictionalized biography of Beau Brummel. That's also a treatise about dandyism. But again, the dandy takes on this figure as like, he is a sort of anti-modern figure resisting democracy and equality and the sameification of humanity, which is again how these writers see it. And while I think it's on the one hand what we can very much critique their critiques of democracy, but what is interesting to me about these sort of reactionary figures is what it seems that they're railing against is not just like democracy as a political institution, but also an industrializing society where there is this fear that human beings are just going to be machines now, that in the era where there's no distinctions among people sort of hierarchically, but also we are in an era of increased mechanical reproduction where everything is being done by machines and we're not doing things by hand. Some irreducible quality to the human person is lost. This, I think, is no coincidence that by the late 19th century in Paris, like everyone's writing and freaking out about robots. The novel from 1884, Tomorrow's Eve by Auguste Villiers de l'Isle-Adam is the first to use the term android of a lady on a lady robot, sexy lady robot, another motive. But this fear of we're gonna lose our individuality in this world that is alienating and terrifying is so deeply bound up, I think, with the passion for and fascination with human beings that somehow are able to like assert their uniqueness. And I think that is something that if I want to defend the aristocratic dandies, despite their somewhat reactionary political valence, I think it's precisely in this desire to say, how do we preserve the uniqueness of the human person when everything about an industrializing modern society seems to kind of make people exchangeable in a fundamental way, or just sort of look at the mob. And I think that tension is actually something that we see carried down in really quite troubling ways in like Nietzsche and D'Annunzio and later Mussolini and fascism, where they kind of use the artistic aesthetic, like we have lost the individual beauty, even as they use the imagery of the crowd in a slightly different way. This aesthetic vision that modernity has taken myth out of life is something that is directly downstream of the dandies and very formative, at least on Italian, if not broader, fascist politics in the following century.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it reminds me a little less grandly of Ratatouille and people's reading of Brad Bird, as kind of this Pixar, genius oriented. There's the line in the movie, genius isn't everywhere, but it can come from anywhere. And it seems like that's this, it can't be controlled, it can't be formulated, it can't be automated, and yet it can't be located in the traditional way. So it kind of tries to fuse those two. we had a question in the chat from Sam, just to kind of, the reason I brought up Ratatouille is not just my own, cinematic preference, but to bring us kind of into the current moment a little bit, and taking what you've done in Self-Made and this historical narrative. Sam brought up the article on the post-rational and kind of the reaction against the hyper-rationalism, asking about the people that in your interviews, the people that brought so quote unquote woo into their lives. How do you weave this into the story of current struggle to figure out, okay, where is tradition? If tradition is not this external canon necessarily, what happens? So if you could just kind of run with that would be great.
Something I find really fascinating about kind of certain contemporary social movements that are either explicitly reactionary or sort of searching for some kind of return in a particular way to something pre-modern. And I would count sort of the post-rat in that group, is a really, to my mind, fascinating attempt to figure out where there's an interest in recovery of wisdom, or recovery of some kind of pre-modern and often more collective knowledge, with something that I think is distinctly modern, which is the self-help idea that the practices and discipline that we cultivate are ultimately so that we can better achieve our own ends, whatever they may be, and that we our purpose is not predetermined. So we might use the wisdom of the Stoics to, like, this is a bit cliche, but like help us, affect a business deal more efficiently, or that we're able to bring these skills into the workplace or into our lives, rather than, let's say, the inevitability of death on how we approach the fact that we will all die. And I think that this kind of combination of a certain kind of pragmatism, like, let's try all this cool stuff that other traditions have done, from psychedelics to meditation to what have you, and like, let's see if let's see if it works. And then from there on, like, the sort of criterion is like, does it work? Where work means, does it make my life better, or does it like make my lived sense of myself better in a noticeable or more robust way? That's the criterion, rather than a kind of external criterion. And I think that is very characteristic. Something that I think is interesting here, and that I got into a little bit in that piece, and hope to develop further in future projects, is the role that specifically the idea of magic has in this, or like the post-rat interest in magic as distinct from other spiritual practices. Because from basically, I want to say around the Renaissance onwards, I think that's when I date it, this idea that magic as a spiritual exercise, or something that you can do that involves harnessing human freedom for human ends. You find this in like the Hermetic magical tradition of Hermes Trismegistus. Thereafter, you certainly find it by like Thelema and Crowley, Aleister Crowley in the 19th century. Like, magic as this kind of para-religion that is focused on human self-creation, self-divinization, but where the ultimate end is like human free choice, including of our own purpose. I think it's kind of very not surprising to me that, given the way that particular strand of that, like the way that meme works, let's say, that this is something that would find its adherents and people interested in it among people who are sort of wedded to, not exclusively, but like are caught up in the modern assumption that our purpose is for us to choose.
Yeah, I think the technological aspect, this kind of relationship between finding these methods and then that leading into this sense of well, that, then is the android the ultimate creation, or the pinnacle? And I think we have a question in the chat about kind of gender and sex and kind of evolving approaches right now. And it seemed to me that your narrative, in addressing that, if I'll throw in kind of an extra element that gender and sex seem to really pervade that automation question too, around like Julie Wask's work, My Fair Ladies. It's all about even women riding bicycles. There was an anxiety about like, oh, this gives women too much self initiative and freedom. But then the sex robot and the ideal woman as being robotic, that your narrative really seems to be able to illuminate like why that dynamic is going on. So yeah, if you wanted to kind of talk about in your book, you definitely talk about in some of the later moments in Jackie Curtis around gender and sex. If you wanted to talk about that.
Sure. So I think I'll make a caveat here that I think that I'm not a sort of gender and sexuality expert, and I think I made a point in writing Self-Made to kind of not. I didn't want it to be a book that focused too much on what I would consider contemporary culture war issues. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more generally and historically. But I think that something that gender and sexuality have always been deeply tied into the figure of the self-creator as someone who transcends quote unquote nature. So the self-creating, the dandy, for example, is often queer coded separately from the sexual orientation of individual dandies. I think actually Brummel's a really interesting example. We don't know anything about Brummel's sex life or attraction one way or the other. Everyone just says like he just seemed like a cold, disinterested fish, and he seemed to just like nobody knows. There were. But he did die of syphilis, so we're not quite sure what happened there. But that's sort of the independently of the individual sexual orientation of anyone involved. This sort of imagery of the androgynous self-creator who does not fulfill expected roles, and part of the way of performing the transcendence of accepted roles is through adopting a persona that is not or that is genderqueer in some sense, or like not gender conforming in some sense. And actually this is a very old phenomenon. I think if you look, there's early sumptuary laws, roughly Renaissance era, for those of you who don't know, popular across Europe, laws that dictate that if you're of a certain rank in the nobility, you can wear certain items, ermine being among the most famous. Now, importantly, like the reason you have to have sumptuary laws is because you are having a kind of rise of middle class with money. So the fact that they exist is itself kind of, it's not evidence that there's a fixed system. It's evidence that there's a threat to a fixed system. Also, they're never really enforced. But that said, in the writing on sumptuary laws, you find a lot of imagery of the people who break the sumptuary laws are characterized as gay or potentially gay. There's a great line that's Renaissance Englishman has of someone who breaks the sumptuary laws is wearing Ganymede's hose, which refers to the famous cupbearer of Zeus, who's this sort of features a lot in sort of homosexual ideology and imagery. So there's this that image is always there, and also the image of sexual transgression is always there. That one of the main ways that society, quote unquote, custom, quote unquote, represses the true natural human being is through prohibitions on sex. And that like one of the ways that the person, someone is authentic and free is through breaking sexual expected codes. You see this, for example, in the French Enlightenment with this sort of crop of what's called the libertine novel, where they're basically pornographic anti-clerical novels where like a young virgin like overhears a priest in a confession like talking about how it's not real and then having sex. Like there's the sort of the porn and aspect and the anti-clerical aspect and the human freedom aspect are all really deeply tied up with one another. And then you see figures like the Marquis de Sade, who really do use sexual transgression as a kind of rhetorical device to talk about what it means to be above the common herd, which is all to say that a kind of mastery over human social relationships and societal expectations is something that the self-maker, the godlike self-maker, is has, and it's one of the ways that and it's usually he proves that he's above the common herd. Like he is above desire, he is above being kind of enchained, he is fully free. And that is something that recurs throughout the self-making tradition, just as I think on the converse side, a lot of anxiety about human freedom or transhumanism or human self-creation, people who are worried about it will all often talk about sex and gender as sites where like we've got to preserve this, like this is the thing, this is where the battle is being fought. I personally do not think this is where the battle needs to be fought at all, but I do think that I think these are the places where this imagery, often for public performance or consumption, separate from or orthogonal to sexual practice, exists. So I hope that's my measured, tactful answer there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
So Tara, every once in a while on my Twitter feed, I'll see a post and it's about some American businessman and how they wake up at 3:30 a.m. and they have an ice bath and then they run a marathon, and they do like 15 things before work begins. And that's related to this idea of kind of democratic aristocracy, a way of showing that you are in fact better than the masses and that success can come through hard work. And you allude to this idea in your book, but I didn't fully understand quite where you think it comes from, which is the moral imperative to become your best self. So in like a flat hierarchy where you have freedom to choose your destiny, you would think people like, you do whatever you want. If you want to be lazy, that's fine, because we can all choose. And where we end up is based on our hard work. But it's not exactly what you see in American culture. It's like you're seen as sinful, slothful, wrong if you're too chill. So like how would you tell a story about this particularly like American imperative to be your best and the self-help motivation coming from? I mean, is it Protestantism? Is it trying to prove to yourself and others that you're saved?
You're on mute still, Tara. Sorry.
You'd think after 3 years of this, I'd be able to do a Zoom call, but there you go. I think that it's partly true, or would say Protestantism is part of the mix, but this is how I would tell the story. The idea of self-governance in the American tradition is inextricably linked to political self-governance. The ideology of American democracy and the liberal tradition is rooted in the idea that we men, and of course, this is coded as men, we men have matured, historically speaking, such that we are ready to and able to govern ourselves. Democracy is allowable because we are industrious, virtuous citizens. And self-governance in this schema is really important, because how can you govern others or govern yourself politically if you can't even govern yourself personally? Like, if you are unable to sort of exert the responsibility over the interior landscape of your own self, and often this like the language and imagery is of cultivation of like interior fields, how on earth could you be expected to govern like in a political way? And one of the most interesting instances that we see this precise movement is in some of the writings of Frederick Douglass on temperance. So Frederick Douglass, born into chattel slavery, escaped it to become a statesman, an orator, abolitionist. Not someone you would expect, at least I didn't expect reading it, to be like somewhat soft on slave owners in this, or those who understood themselves as owning slaves. But he writes on temperance that if we could just get slave owners sober, if we could get them to stop drinking, that would be a huge boon to the abolitionist cause, because if we could get them off the sauce, they would start thinking more seriously about the morality of their actions, and that would help them realize that it is an evil and wicked thing to participate in the institution of slavery, and it would help them stop. And central to this understanding and this sort of virtue ethics that he has is this idea that there's a kind of bondage you can be in to certain kinds of sin and ignorance, where it is only by like acting virtuously to get yourself out of that mire is part of being free, as well as part of legitimizing yourself as politically free in a political system. And so this idea of sort of hard work and self-governance, I think like has a really great like virtue ethicsy root in the American tradition. However, something kind of weird happens in the 19th century. That's really just true in a lot of places. Just like the 19th century was a very weird time for, you know, everyone. I say this with great love. I love the 19th century. And somewhere along the lines, this very like measured, statesman-y, small r Republican vision of a virtuous citizenry practicing self-governance in order to have a good society turns into like untrammeled capitalist pursuit of wealth. The self-made man, for much of the 19th century, that term is not used for these wildly wealthy entrepreneurs. It's not used for the billionaires. It's used for like modest middle-class people who came from nothing and became statesmen. It's used of Abraham Lincoln. It's used of Frederick Douglass himself. There's all of these little like secular hagiographies that get published around this time with titles like Self-Made Men, or in Emerson's case, Representative Men. It's a little different, but that you're supposed to model yourself as an American off these like modest, virtuous individuals. And then suddenly all that changes. And it changes in part because of the wealth inequality of the Gilded Age. It changes, I think, in part because of the rise of this movement called New Thought, which is this, it starts out as a faith healing movement in the 1860s, think positive and you'll be cured of your illness, and kind of morphs into this broader vision of think positively and you will be rich. And it gets sort of bound up with then novel scientific discoveries, or kind of what I would call parascientific discoveries, which is say the like woo popularization pseudoscience version of the real thing of both electricity and evolution. So there sort of becomes this idea takes hold in the American consciousness based on like pop evolution and pop electricity, that basically there's just currents of vibes running out there in the universe. There's just flowing energy and power, and that it is sort of tied up with other notions like vitalism at this time, but like there's this sort of lifey power technology that some people can just harness, and they can harness it kind of literally in the Edison way, like he harnesses electricity and he turns on the light bulb, or they can harness it in this kind of psychological way. They're thinking positively, and that means that they're in touch with the electricity of the universe, and that's going to cause them to manifest wealth and success. And this gets tied up with this notion of, you know, the universe has a desire, and it is for individual people to be rich, and those who do not go to the top of the evolutionary heap, who are sick and who die, like that's just what we need for the like roses to bloom, is for the weak roses to die. I think it's John Rockefeller, I believe he uses the rose metaphor in a Sunday school sermon that he preaches. But what kind of starts out as something that's quite modest and rooted in virtue ends up through this sort of weird, slightly occult tinged cultural phenomenon, becoming about being able to basically be better at being human by being in touch with the universe in this way. And so it's a kind of combination of a moral imperative to work with a spiritual sense that some people are just more in touch with the vibes of the universe. And that we kind of retcon our way back into the divine favor model of the self-maker. That the successful, in a sense, are closer to God. They're closer to the divine because they understand the vibes of the universe. And I think that it's precisely that model that I think is still true today, or still implicit.
Yeah, no longer blessed are the poor and the meek. Ben Peters brought up a very good question about the link between literacy and full humanity as modernity progresses. And you spend a lot of time in your book constantly bringing attention back to the way that the old ancien regime order breaks down. There's a post-1789 flattening of hierarchy in theory. But instead of like 3 classes or 5 or whatever, you sort of end up with the majestic, noble few who can rise above the herd and make themselves fully human. And then like the rest of the masses who are just boring, and what online types call NPCs. And that often has gender and racial codings. And there really is there's a sort of constantly this flip side to the excitement of self-fashioning and the God's bastards who do amazing things, sometimes just for mysterious attention-grabbing reasons, but that it leaves so many people behind. So how do you think through, like, is this just a problem we'll have to always live with in like an ostensibly egalitarian society, or are there ways of thinking about excellence and have-nots that might help? I remember Alain de Botton helped me see this difference in a beautiful way. He said, in previous centuries, you might call those who are struggling or poor unfortunate. Now we call them losers. So what do we do about losers?
I think that the best, I think that if our standards for goodness are or like successful humaning are linked to successful self-fashioning, then it will automatically lead to those who have not successfully fashioned themselves are the NPCs, or the losers, they're the sheeple, they're simply the people who didn't do the thing that makes us human. But if we I think that the trick is like, I think being human is kind of enough. Like, being human is constitutive of itself. And I think that any attempt to find the thing that makes us human, whether we're talking about human reason or human emotion or certain capacities that human beings have, what you risk doing is saying, like, if this is the thing that makes us human, only by participating more or less in that thing are you more or less human. Whereas just being a human is itself enough. And I think that and I think this is probably one of my like religiously rooted convictions as a Christian, is that like to be human is to be made in the image and likeness of God. And that is complicated and we can work out what that means. But you can just be human. You don't need a kind of accounting of humanness other than that. That only serves to narrow our sense of what humanity is. Like, humanity itself is what it is, and I'm very wary of any attempts to kind of codify it. If I were to try and make some sort of, I won't say, again, not a codification, a descriptive thing, and this is not original here, this is just Hamlet. One of the things that makes us, that seems to be true of being human, is that we have a lot of creative mental freedom, generally speaking, and are also animals in bodies that need other beings. And this is weird and confusing. And like to talk about the human condition means contending with this thing. And I think that any account of humanity that does not contend with the fact that being human is like contradictory and difficult and confusing is also flawed, even as I don't think we should sort of set a criterion. And I think what that means in the case of how do we talk about quote unquote losers, the quote unquote unfortunate, it's like no differently than you would talk about anyone else. Like you talk about people as people in the fullness of their specific lattice of individual traits and circumstance. And I don't even know how we even can successfully diagnose. Like you can't even if you were to look at your best friend or your partner or your spouse, someone you know really intimately, I don't think it would be possible to tease out, well, this element of them is just because their mom did this, or this element of them is just because they're from X background, or this element from them is like really truly them. Like we don't tease the people we know out this way, or I mean, we shouldn't.
Anna, go right ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a related question, and maybe this is the right moment to ask. What do we think about the pathologization of morality? In prep for this salon, I had reread, Tara, your piece on therapy speak, and had a little bit of, to kind of like stay in the meta framework, I had a mini PTSD reaction to it, because it reminded me of people who, when I approach them, I might approach them with something that to me seems like a moral question or claim, where I appeal to their free will and their agency. They might respond in this almost medical language about their actions. And I'm wondering whether you guys think that's an overreaction maybe to this. So you have the unfortunates where the locus of control is mostly with God, right? Job received all the undue punishments, and so do we, because the divine ways are mysterious. And then comes the self-made man, where the locus of control is with you. Therefore, if you're unsuccessful or if you're suffering, it's very likely your fault. You didn't do something. You are sick because you had negative thoughts, or you had an unhealthy lifestyle, etc., or you have unresolved problems with your mother. And then, comes a generation that might feel very much out of control, that is living in what is called an increasingly complex world, which is a euphemism for how much we feel governed by technology, which is other people's constant attention, or constant perceived or possible potential attention. And maybe this is a way to kind of like push the control away, to say, oh, but I don't know, I remember somebody once, a contractor didn't respond to my email for 3 days, and then sent me an email saying that, oh, sorry, I have avoidant attachment disorder. And I was so stunned. I thought, maybe this is true, but first of all, if you can't respond to emails because you have this problem, you should not be working, or you should like somehow, I don't know, there should be something, an out of office, automated email to tell me this. But also, it's none of my business, right? And I'm wondering whether you feel that there is a change in which era of moral philosophy we might be inhabiting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the medicalization of all this human stuff. The most charitable way that I would describe it is an attempt to recreate a new vocabulary for understanding the fact that there are moral and social behaviors that are a little bit out of our control, but a little bit under our control, and that we don't fully understand or have access to how much control we have over them at any given point. And I think that like the language of trauma, medicine, and disorder does get, it points to something, just as like one, you know, in as speaking as a Christian, like the idea that without grace, we are sort of bound to sin. Like maybe I should start when I don't answer your emails, I'm like, I'm so sorry, I'm a fallen creature. I too am subject to original sin, and I will the good, but I will my own good more than the good. And like I think I'm like, I'm sorry I didn't answer your email, and it's just original sin.
Like not in the state of grace right now, and I can't deal with your shit right now. I would love that. That would be really honest. And
total depravity of man. The only way I could answer your email is through God's grace. But which is to say, like, I do think that there is something useful in the fact that we're trying to wrestle with the question of why we know what is good and don't do it, and can't seem to bring ourselves to do it. And this is not a modern Zoomer problem. This is just a human problem. Where I think that both the kind of self-help language of like, well, you could get it, like, I think that the, like, you could get it done if you took an ice bath at 3 a.m. Those people, it is sometimes useful, I think, to return to the culture, the notion that we do have some kind of control over our actions, or that certain developments of habit and the fostering of repeated activity, even when it's not directly downstream of our desires, can shape our desires. Like, you know, you go for a run every morning and you don't want to, but then like your endorphins are good, and then you realize you enjoy being active. Like this kind of idea that like sometimes doing what you don't want to do will change your effective dispositions is a wisdom that, like, for all that I roll my eyes at the ice bath people, yeah, that's great, we should take that. But I think that we're both the kind of like, I can't answer this email because mental health reasons, and everyone should just take an ice bath at 3 a.m. People are both falling short, is like, what is this ultimately for? What are you doing this for? Because if like you're getting up at 3 a.m. to take an ice bath so that you could make $1 billion and be really wealthy and have like certain earthly success, like, sure, you could do that, but like there's not really like a moral weight here. If the question is, how do I ensure that I am sufficiently energetic and focused so that I can spend my day doing good and, you know, being, whether it's through meaningful work or through acts of love of one's neighbor, like, is one living a virtuous, good life, is really a question that needs to be answered first. And then the sort of second downstream questions of, well, like, what ways that I can, like, how can I act in my daily life to best pursue the good, are really downstream of that. And I think that in the absence of that sense of purpose, like, I don't know, if I felt like I really wasn't doing anything with my life, or that my work was not in any way related to kind of a wider project of being a human in the world, I probably really wouldn't feel motivated to answer emails either. Like, it's hard enough for me to answer emails when I do feel excited about things. So which is all a long way to saying, I think that in general, this highly individualistic language around either lack of control of oneself, medicalizing it, or total control of oneself, are both limited by not having a robust account of the final end of like what any of this is for. And I think that without that, it all just sort of collapses into the same kind of solipsism, just from different sides.
I want to follow up on that if I can, because it's from that point and the point that you made about criteria, and that basically the chase after criteria is always going to fall prey to the fall. It's going to fall short of that Shakespearean view of kind of the creative expanse contained in the nutshell of a mortal, comically fragile body. And so I wanted to ask you kind of in the contemporary moment now, and from my vantage point, hearing and contending with people that say to me, well, soon enough, AI will be complicated enough that we're not going to be able to deny it conscious being. And the frustration that I feel is I think you really articulated it, and I'm wondering if you would agree or put it better than I could. But I feel like that whole game of, well, we're going to set out some type of criteria or external, measure that in economics they call it Goodhart's law. You set out a measure and you make it the prime thing, and then all of a sudden everything shifts to the measure, and it no longer measures, it no longer captures the reality that it was meant to. And it seems like it's the same type of shell game here, that it's almost a losing proposition from the very beginning to say, well, no, there's just this special thing that we seem to be getting into a similar where, as opposed to reframing and saying, well, let's not have the first priority being making that stark divide and asking, what kind of energy is being used, what's about the environment, what about reality as it is, instead of projecting of the trillion humans in the future and where that discourse goes. So I just wanted to know if you had any leading thoughts or intuitions around that kind of theme. Sorry, you're on mute again.
Never learning. I'm never going to learn. A curiosity that I have about this is, I think the point at which, I think there's two separate questions, and I think like they're often kind of conflated under like liberalism makes everything neutral, but like, which I think is the kind of maybe like a knee-jerk small c conservative response to the question of modernity, which is how, like, what does it mean to effectively live in a pluralistic society is a little bit different from like, what does it actually mean for a human person, a human individual or community to live without a sense of an exterior transcendent purpose for being. And that latter question, which is the one that I think is like concerns me most now, is that the kind of social collective evaporation of this, like it feels almost quaint to talk about like good and evil and transcendent morality and transcendent purpose. It feels like, I might be on I'm like on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood Show or something. And I don't have an answer to like how you do this in a pluralistic society, but I think that when the assumption is that we all get to choose our own purpose, and that the way to understand that purpose is through our desires, we fundamentally lose a grounding for understanding our own actions, but also having a way to talk about why we're doing anything beyond pure self-preservation. And I think in the absence, I sometimes think this, that in the absence of visions of like transcendent values, like what's wrong with the kind of Nietzschean vision of the self-creator is like, yeah, well, winner takes all, the person who is most effective at doing all of this gets to shape reality. Like that does seem to be a consistent, if to my mind morally appalling worldview. So I do I don't know whether like the project of attempting to whether the project of attempting where we the assumption that we are all in charge of our own purposes and that our own desire and only like our psychological felt perception can lead us to that purpose, whether there's really any way out of that. I think I am quite I'm optimistic that many people, particularly young people, feel that this is unsatisfactory, are drawn to sources of difficulty precisely out of a not particularly coherence is not the word I mean to, like out of a general sense that like challenges are good and something coming from outside is good and useful. Like this is where I see like the success of someone like Jordan Peterson. There is something there. There is a there, and it is to. There's got to be something more than just what I want. But even then, if you're just looking for challenge for the sake of challenging, like whether you're getting on a soul cycle or doing something that's hard because it's hard, like you're in the place where you started. You're just like more muscular now.
So Tara, I want to continue on the theme. As with many Christian communities, and other religious communities in the US and the Western world more broadly, we've seen like pretty massive disaffection accelerating among younger populations. And the survey data is like pretty profound, like just younger people just do not connect with institutional religion. And in many ways, they don't connect with institutions at all. And across the board, just right, institutional affiliation and connection, joining, huge decline. So on a surface reading, it's like, well, individualism explains this. It's like very hard to submit your desires and will and vision to the collective, even for the collective good, because we just like really get reinforced that your desires and your thoughts are the ones that count. So looking at this phenomenon, do you predict that religion will continue to be hyper self-curated and people will just make a religion of one to meet their spiritual needs going forward? Or is there any world in which older Christian traditions can adapt to the new expectations?
They can, but I don't think that they should, and I don't think it would be doing any good. Which is to say, I think that the one thing that like organized religion has is a claim on transcendent truth claims, like a claim to be offering challenge in the form of like, yeah, we believe this happened, and like Jesus came back from the dead, and that's what we believe, and you're welcome. But like that is indeed what we believe. Like I think that once, like if you seed that, there is no reason to be like, don't spend an hour and a half on a Sunday like sitting in a room if you don't think it's true, or like if you're not sure it's true, maybe, or if you hope it's true, or you're curious whether it might be true. But if like the priest's up there being like, well, this is all like load of bull, but we're just, it's okay because we're here. I think that's a recipe for disaster. I think and I think that it's precisely by keeping calm and carrying on, whether there's 3 people in the congregation or 5 or 3,000, that churches can best weather the storm of modernity precisely by doing what they've always done, which is the mass the way they think. I mean, I'm coming from the Episcopal church, like I'm an Anglo-Catholic, so I'm like, well, we'll just do the mass with the prayer book the way we've done it. Like there's a rubric for it, and I think that that's good, and I think that it creates a continuity that it is there for those who want it, seek it out, and it has not changed in an era where everything else is about like maximizing your wellness or maximizing your spiritual wellness, or like how does this make you feel after. And I think that what I think that we are distrustful institutions. I think you're completely right, Zach. But I also think that what is a great shame, and I think that many of these institutions have squandered our trust. Like I don't think it's sort of you can tell the story about the decline of organized religion in the United States or elsewhere without talking about things like the Catholic sex abuse scandals and other times where institutions that like had our trust squandered it. But that said, I think that something that institutions do well, remain and continue to do well, and that I would like to see more of in public life is the kind of fostering of fostering of virtues, make it sound like a Boy Scout, but fostering of dispositions, including virtuous dispositions through action. Like doing something you don't really want to do because it has to get done. In a way that is apparent that it is for certain kinds of goods of the community, or at least the community doing it. It's a very good way of kind of, to use some self-help language, like rewiring your brain. Like it's a way that you become regularly inculcated with the idea that sometimes doing stuff that's not pleasant or interesting or fun can be fulfilling and enjoyable in this deeper sense, either because of the relationships you form with the people you're like doing it with, or because of the outcome is something fulfilling or good, or because you yourself find yourself changed. I think my biggest one of the many things I was wrong about as a theater kid teenager was that team sports were terrible. I wish I'd played team sports. I feel like this is a good virtue you get from team sports. But I think that one of the, again, this is a kind of mistake of like certain, let's say, masculinist, like we should just get, train young men in discipline in this certain way, so that, like, I saw this thing on Twitter about like father playing with his son, they're playing knights with wooden swords, and it was about who's going to teach his kid to be dangerous. And it's like, I actually see where you're going with this. I think that inculcating people with certain kind of habitual virtues is good, but it is good ultimately because being able to enjoy and take pleasure in the necessary parts of communal life is a good thing to do, not because that discipline, you can take that discipline and apply it like in a purely individualistic sense in the workplace, or in your personal relationships in a particular way. Like this is a good. And I at my most optimistic, I think maybe we're not necessarily going to get people back in churches in the same way, but I think that we will see a rise of interest in being involved in at least some kind of institution or some kind of organized capacity, because that is something that people are missing, even if it is something they're missing in a kind of vitamin C deficiency way, rather than with a cohesive sense of like the wider metaphysical picture of what might have been lost.
Yeah, Anna said in the chat about America needs preacher archetypes, and that was something that I was thinking about around this kind of cultural analysis, which is the prophet, or the person that or even community that whose search for integrity is about, and I think you kind of alluded to this in kind of being patient, or being a small group, but maintaining some type of integrity or some type of accountability that is represented by a withdrawal, or basically we're not playing, we're not participating in the same way. And I know that you've done research, and you've written really trenchant things on why the discourse of cults is not helpful, and why it kind of tars certain groups with things that larger organized religion does as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if or are there communities where you in particular see some of those seeds? I'll let you answer that first. I have an inter-intellect cross promotion to make that Anna probably knows what I'm talking about, but I want to answer that ask that before we
so a place that I found this recently, and I'm smiling at Zach because I think he was there too. Zach and I were both recently at the Plow Writers Weekend for Writers for Plow magazine, which is run by and hosted by the Bruderhof, which are an intentional religious community, a Christian community, Anabaptist. But to say, like, they're like the Amish, but they can drink and tweet. And like I spent time with a lot of members, older and younger, and like one of the really it affected me a lot. And they sort of there's no private property. They kind of all share all resources. They all do what work needs to be done. And I'm not going to say that like it's a perfect community. Every community has its challenges, but what really struck me was the way in which everyday life and everyday work was such a source of joy, precisely because there was a clear sense of, well, we are doing this for a community. And you might have someone one day, everyone who is able to work in some capacity is given the kind of work that they're able to do. So if someone who might, someone might be only able to do a little, who is older, might not have certain physical abilities, but still is going to find some way of contributing. And it was just, there was a guy there, his daughter wanted to play harp. He was a woodworker. Harps are expensive. He just built a harp. It's the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And it was just, build a harp. There was a member of the community who was ill and not doing well. And they decided, well, we're just going to put on our favorite musical. We're going to just do a production of Les Miserables. So the whole community came together and they built the sets and they did the costumes, they rehearsed it. And like, there was a sense where both work and play in this community were about doing what was necessary for the community in a way that seems so profoundly unalienated that I found myself wondering, like, how does one live like this, like outside of the bucolic farm with baby goats in upstate New York? Like, how do you have, because it wasn't just about the farm or the baby goats or the sort of the aesthetics of any particular moment. I think it was the sense that a realization that every action was done to be a bit spiritual, but like was done with love and was done with attention, and that the outcome of the action was not just whatever the action was, but for the glory of God and the good of the community both. I think it was a model for me of how communities ought to be, even as I have absolutely no idea how you get from small Anabaptist intentional community to like the running of the rest of the world. But I did see a model in what I think good communal life ought to be there. I don't know what you thought, Zach.
Yeah, it's totally inspiring. And in some ways, it made me sad because early Mormonism had this potential within it. It had a vision of early Christian communal life, and it failed. Like, it just, human nature blasted that away. But yeah, the Bruderhof is amazing. And I mean, so in the last two books, you've written about the weird times we're in, the strange remixing that's happening. And I think, like you, like, I'm so deeply romantic. Like, I'm both attracted to some pre-modern forms of organic community, at least the myth of it, but well read enough to know that like it was a fantasy. You can't return to that thing, and constantly searching like what are models that aren't going to solve all problems, but maybe move us past like just the insane commodification of the human being that we see today. And so I want to hear from you, like maybe as a starting to wind down, like your epilogue to this work calls for a recognition that we're social animals in Aristotle's terms, that we are mutually dependent on one another, that we ought to think about each other more, care for each other more. And that goes against all the trends that we're seeing. And like as people pointed out, like if you were to design a perfect phenomenon that could unite a people, it'd be like a mass pandemic. Like in theory, that could have been this thing, and that didn't do it. And I think that's why accelerationist ideas are quite trenchant right now. Like among the Curtis Yarvin right people who kind of want collapse and then a new Caesar to emerge, or among the social justice left, where it's like a horizon of perfect utopia. Like where are you seeing some seeds of hope for the society that you hope we can move towards?
Oh man.
If any.
So honestly,
Intellect.
this is not my so my friend group's doing great. Thanks for asking. Or what I mean is, I think friendship. I think I have a group of friends, and during the pandemic, we became like basically a family. You know, there was a lot of outdoor socializing when that was what was safe, and or perceived to be safe. And I think that I came out of the pandemic having been someone who was like, this is going to get us all collectivist, and then being kind of radicalized into a certain vision of collectivism, and then being very disappointed and quite frankly depressed when that didn't happen. I think that I am more convinced ever that friendship, and particularly political friendship, and I'll expand what I mean by that in a second, is like the only workable antidote to this kind of atomization and self-making, which is to say, and by political friendship, I mean friendship that is like robust, it is reciprocal, but it is designed towards the building of a community where the understanding of kind of that community is a good to be fostered. You know, this is not someone you just like are catching up with about your life as happening elsewhere. It is someone with whom you live your life. And I think that those friendships, are antidotes to self-making, or this kind of self-making, because if you ever tried to like try on a new persona among someone that like around someone who knows you really well, you know precisely that look of like, what are you doing? Like that look on the face of your friend who knows you really well when you're doing something really dumb. That is like, that keeps you honest. That is just like a moral good we should all have. And I think that precisely because friendship is in some ways a voluntaristic commitment, in some ways not, like you choose your friends, but you also choose to remain friends with someone even when you know, parts of your lives pull you apart, but also you make friends by virtue of where you are geographically as well as, you know, online. That there is like the communities of friendship are precisely where you can find that balance between certain kinds of creative freedom or certain kinds of independence and certain kinds of givenness. I'm also and this is a personal account, I don't know how useful this is for a wider view. I moved to a very bizarre neighborhood in New York, and Anna's visited me there, called Red Hook, which is hard to get to. There's no subway. It's a historic shipbuilding neighborhood, so you get there by ferry on the waterfront, or there's a bus. But because it's sort of isolated and a little like weird and arty, everybody knows everybody. And as someone who grew up as a New Yorker, who like I'm used to the anonymous city of Manhattan, this is still very much part of New York, but it is everybody knows everybody in a way that means that there's certain kinds of relationships I have with my neighbors that I have never had before. I have there's a guy I see every morning at my coffee shop. We know each other. We're friends. I see him all the time. Like there are people I have conversations with every day that we like have helped each other out when either of us have needed it in the course of like neighborhood life, where they're like, there's a category of person that is my neighbor that is slightly different from like a friend that I picked who's like another young professional in New York, or a family member where there's sort of no element of choice. And I think that getting to know one's neighbors, regardless of where one lives or what that looks like, is one of those ways that you just sort of habituate yourself to being part of a community. And I think that basically any kind of small scale, either on the policy level or on the individual practice level, but like any kind of small scale decision that fosters interactions with the people that you actually live with and near is just like a political good that is good for everyone involved, not just because of the individual outcomes involved, but because of the kind of, when you think of yourself as a member of this neighborhood, when you all think of yourself as neighbors, that is a starting point for a better way of being in the world. So yeah, those are friendships and friends and neighbors. God, I really am on Mr. Rogers today.
Well, I'll take us out of Mr. Rogers with through a salon that I understand that you're going to be doing with Caroline Calloway, who's the example you cite in in your epilogue. And so I as kind of a bridge to that event and kind of a nod to how we started about how weird this moment feels right now. I think she is an icon of what is going on. Could you just say a word or two as we start to wind down about her and your fitting into the story?
Caroline Calloway, what to say about Caroline Calloway? Well, for starters, if you come back on the 28th, we're doing a salon with her. But what fascinates me about Caroline Calloway is that she is unapologetically embodying the artificiality, authenticity kind of collapse that she is utterly herself by presenting herself as who she wants to be without any interest in like whether this is true or not. Like the jokes about her being a scammer are funny in part because she doesn't care. Reality is what she makes it. This is how she presents herself. And I think that in this way, she's sort of the id of an entire cultural moment, which is what I think makes her so fascinating. I don't know. And one of the things I'm looking forward to discussing with her is how conscious this is. Like, is this ideologically true for her that reality is downstream of whatever she makes it? Or is she like an egregore made up by the internet and she is not kind of conscious of it? Well, no, who can say, who can see? But certainly I think that her appeal is this kind of, she wants attention very badly. She's very open about wanting attention, but in such a way that comes across as not caring what people think, because she does not present any kind of shame about wanting the attention that she wants. And so simultaneously, she comes off very authentic in her inauthenticity. And that is something that fascinates me about her. Also, hilariously, and we've had sort of weirdly parallel lives. She was at my high school a year after I graduated, and then she was at Cambridge when I was at Oxford. So I have this image of like, as someone who is in love with, at a time, living life as art, I have a particular fondness for Caroline Calloway. She is also not the basis. She is. I'll leave it there for now because I want to get into the Caroline Calloway stuff more next week. But she might be my evil doppelganger. Maybe we'll see. I'll ask her if she is, and I'll see what she says.
That's awesome. Well, I think we're right at 2 hours, and unless we have any other benedictions or parting words, I just want to thank everyone for attending, for the comments in the chat, and the links. We will record all of those and keep those for future reference. Zach, I don't know if you have any last words, but thank you, Tara, so much. Thanks to all of you. And
buy Tara's book, tell all your friends, buy
absolutely.
it for your family members.
Put that in the chat.
Very good. It's got the nice, I guess they went with Da Vinci rather than Dürer because the Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
I don't know what Dürer picture in Kardashian get pretty X-rated.
I wanted it to be called From Albert Dürer to OnlyFans, but that wasn't so saleable.
Nice.
Have a lovely rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.